The snow began falling at sunset, thick flakes that caught the dying light like scattered diamonds. Samuel Morrison pulled his wool coat tighter as he watched from the window of his ranch house. The warmth from the fireplace at his back a stark contrast to the bitter cold settling over the Arizona high country. At 62, he had seen plenty of harsh winters, but something about this storm felt different, more dangerous. His ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of rugged terrain, bordered by Apache tribal lands to the east. The relationship between his family and the local Apache had been tense for generations, rooted in old conflicts and misunderstandings that seemed impossible to bridge. Samuel's grandfather had fought in the Apache Wars, and stories of raids and retaliation had been passed down like family heirlooms, polished with each telling until they gleamed with bitter resentment. The wind howled around the corners of the sturdy log house, rattling the windows in their frames. Samuel's wife Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Storm's getting worse," she observed, joining him at the window. "Haven't seen snow like this in years." Samuel nodded grimly. The weather report had predicted a light dusting, but nature had other plans. Already 6 inches covered the ground and the snow showed no signs of stopping. His cattle would need extra hay in the morning, assuming the roads remained passable. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and the mountain passes could become impassable within hours during a storm like this. "Better check on the animals one more time," Samuel said, reaching for his heavy coat and boots. This wind could tear the barn doors right off their hinges. Martha watched him bundle up, concern creasing her weathered face. "Don't stay out there too long. Radio says the temperature's dropping to 20 below. The cold hit Samuel like a physical blow when he stepped outside. The snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see the barn 50 yards away. His boots crunched through the accumulating drifts as he made his way across the yard, the beam of his flashlight creating a narrow tunnel of visibility in the swirling white chaos. Inside the barn, his horses whinnied nervously, sensing the storm's intensity. Samuel checked their water, which hadn't frozen yet, and added extra hay to their stalls. The building groaned under the wind's assault, but the structure was solid. His grandfather had built it to last, using timber from the surrounding forest and techniques learned from a lifetime of harsh winters. As he prepared to leave, a sound caught his attention over the storm's roar. At first, he thought it might be a branch scraping against the barn's roof, but there was something rhythmic about it, almost like breathing. Samuel paused, listening intently. There it was again, coming from somewhere near the barn's east wall. Curiosity overcoming caution, Samuel grabbed a larger lantern and stepped back into the storm. The sound led him around the barn's perimeter, where the wind had carved deep drifts against the building's foundation. His light swept across the snow-covered landscape until it illuminated something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A figure huddled against the barn wall, barely visible beneath a thin blanket that was already white with accumulated snow. Samuel's first instinct was to call out, but something made him approach more cautiously. As he drew closer, his lantern revealed a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, with long black hair and the distinctive features of the local Apache people. She was conscious, but shivering violently, her lips already showing the blue tinge of hypothermia. What shocked Samuel most was her apparent lack of proper cold weather gear. She wore only a light jacket and thin pants, completely inadequate for the brutal conditions. No fire, no shelter beyond the barn's partial windbreak, no visible supplies or provisions. For a moment, the old prejudices rose in Samuel's mind. Apache on his land during a storm, with no apparent reason for being there. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, warning about trusting the local tribes, about raids and theft and violence. But looking at this girl, barely more than a child, those warnings seemed suddenly hollow and cruel. The young woman's eyes met his, and Samuel saw no fear there, only a quiet determination that somehow seemed familiar. She spoke in Apache, her voice barely audible over the wind, then switched to heavily accented English. "No harm," she said simply. "Only shelter from storm." Samuel stood frozen for a moment, torn between ingrained suspicion and basic human decency. The snow continued to fall around them, and he realized that regardless of who she was or why she was there, she would likely die of exposure if left outside much longer. The temperature was still dropping and the storm showed no signs of abating. "Can you walk?" he asked, extending his hand. The girl nodded and struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as the cold and exhaustion took their toll. Samuel noticed that she made no move to take his offered help, maintaining her independence even in her weakened state. There was something admirable about her refusal to show weakness, even when facing life-threatening conditions. As they made their way toward the house, Samuel's mind raced with questions. How had she ended up here? Why was she traveling in such dangerous weather with so little protection? And perhaps most importantly, what would Martha think about bringing an Apache stranger into their home? The warm air inside the house felt like stepping into another world. Martha looked up from her knitting as they entered, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of the young woman. Samuel quickly explained the situation, watching his wife's face for her reaction. Martha had always been more open-minded than he was, more willing to see people as individuals rather than representatives of old conflicts. Without hesitation, Martha rose and guided the girl toward the fireplace. "Poor child," she murmured, helping her out of the wet jacket. "You're half frozen." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with hot soup and blankets, her maternal instincts overriding any cultural barriers. As the girl warmed herself by the fire, Samuel found himself studying her more closely. Despite her ordeal, there was something composed about her, as if sleeping in a snowstorm without fire was not entirely unexpected. She accepted their help graciously, but without the desperate gratitude he might have expected from someone rescued from certain death. The storm continued to rage outside, and Samuel realized that regardless of the circumstances that had brought her here, they were all trapped together until the weather cleared. This Apache girl, this unexpected visitor, was about to teach him lessons about survival that would challenge everything he thought he knew. The girl sat by the fireplace, steam rising from her damp clothes as the warmth slowly returned to her body. Samuel watched from his chair across the room, still wrestling with the surreal nature of the situation. An Apache woman in his living room, rescued from a blizzard that could have killed her within hours. The irony wasn't lost on him that his grandfather's greatest enemies were now sitting at his hearth, sharing his food and warmth. Martha bustled around with practiced efficiency, bringing more blankets and a second bowl of soup. "What's your name, dear?" she asked gently, settling into her own chair with her knitting. "Ayana," the girl replied, her voice stronger now that the worst of the cold had left her. "It means eternal blossom in my language." She paused, studying Samuel's weathered face. "You are Morrison, yes?" "The rancher." Samuel nodded, surprised that she knew his name. "You know of me?" A small smile crossed Ayana's lips. "Everyone knows Morrison Ranch. Your cattle sometimes wander onto tribal land. Usually we just drive them back." She sipped the hot soup carefully. "Your grandfather, he was different, man. More angry." The comment stung because it was true. Samuel's grandfather had been consumed by hatred for the Apache, viewing them as obstacles to progress and prosperity. Samuel had inherited some of that resentment, though he'd tried to temper it with reason over the years. Hearing it acknowledged so matter-of-factly by this young woman made him uncomfortable. "Why were you out in the storm?" Martha asked, her voice free of judgment. "Surely your family must be worried." Ayana's expression grew more serious. "I was tracking wounded deer. Shot by poacher but not clean kill. Animal suffered." She gestured toward the storm raging outside. "Weather changed fast. Sometimes mountains do this." Samuel leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "You were tracking in weather like this? Without proper gear?" Apache learned to read sky to prepare for what comes, but sometimes helping wounded animal more important than comfort. Ayana's dark eyes met his directly. "Grandfather teach me that all life connected. When something suffers, we all suffer." The philosophy struck Samuel as both foreign and oddly familiar. His own grandfather had taught him to read weather signs and animal behavior, but always in service of protecting the ranch and livestock. The idea of risking one's safety for a wounded wild animal seemed impractical, even reckless. Martha set down her knitting. "That's very compassionate of you. Did you find the deer?" Ayana nodded. "Found her sheltered in rocks about a mile from here. Had to end her suffering, but storm came too fast to make it home." She glanced around the comfortable room. "So I found shelter where I could. Against my barn in a blizzard without even a fire," Samuel said, still incredulous. "How did you plan to survive the night?" The question seemed to amuse Ayana. "Survival is not about comfort, Mr. Morrison. It's about understanding what body needs, what mind needs. Fire draws attention, uses energy to maintain. Sometimes better to conserve heat, find windbreak, stay still. Samuel felt a flicker of irritation. You would have died out there. The temperature dropped to 20 below. Maybe, Ayanna acknowledged calmly. But Apache ancestors survive in mountains for hundreds of years before white men bring wood stoves and thick walls. We learn from cold, not just fight against it. Martha exchanged a glance with her husband, sensing the tension building in the conversation. Well, you're safe now, and that's what matters. This storm should pass by morning. But Samuel wasn't ready to let the topic drop. Something about the girl's casual dismissal of the danger bothered him. You're telling me your people can just sleep in snowstorms without fire? That's not survival, that's foolishness. Ayanna studied him for a long moment before responding. Your grandfather, during Apache wars, he sleep in snow many times, yes? Soldiers learn to survive without comfort when necessary. Apache children learned same lessons but different way. The comparison to his grandfather's military service caught Samuel off guard. He had grown up hearing stories of harsh campaigns in the mountains, of soldiers enduring terrible conditions in pursuit of Apache bands. But those stories had always emphasized the suffering and hardship, not the adaptation and learning. It's different, Samuel said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Is it? Ayanna asked quietly. Or maybe just different, teacher? The conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crash from outside, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. Samuel jumped to his feet and peered out the window, but the swirling snow made it impossible to see what had happened. Sounded like it came from the barn, Martha said worriedly. Samuel was already reaching for his coat when Ayanna stood up. I come with you, she said simply. You don't need to do that. You're still recovering from being half frozen. Ayanna was already putting on her thin jacket, which had dried by the fire but still looked inadequate for the conditions outside. Two people safer than one in storm like this. And I know how to move in snow. Against his better judgment, Samuel found himself nodding. There was something about the girl's quiet confidence that inspired trust, even though he barely knew her. Together they bundled up and stepped back into the howling blizzard. The snow had deepened considerably since Samuel's earlier trip to the barn. What had been 6 inches was now approaching a foot, with drifts piling much higher against buildings and fences. The wind had gained strength too, turning the falling snow into horizontal needles that stung exposed skin. Ayanna moved through the storm with a fluid grace that surprised Samuel. While he struggled to maintain his footing in the deepening snow, she seemed to glide across the surface, reading the terrain beneath and finding the most stable path. Her thin frame cut through the wind rather than fighting against it, and she moved with an economy of motion that conserved energy. When they reached the barn, they found that a large pine tree had fallen across the roof, crushing one corner of the building. Snow was already beginning to accumulate inside through the damaged section, and Samuel could hear his horses nickering nervously in their stalls. Animals are scared but not hurt, Ayanna observed, apparently able to interpret the sounds more accurately than Samuel could. But roof will not hold much more weight if snow keeps falling. Samuel surveyed the damage with growing concern. The fallen tree was massive, far too heavy for 2 people to move, and the damaged roof section was already sagging dangerously. If more snow accumulated on the compromised structure, the entire barn could collapse. We need to get the horses out, he decided. Move them to the smaller shed until I can get help to fix this. Ayanna nodded and followed him into the barn. The horses were indeed agitated. Their eyes rolling white as snow continued to blow through the damaged roof. Samuel approached his oldest mare, speaking in soothing tones, but the animal shied away from his outstretched hand. Let me, Ayanna said softly. She moved toward the frightened horses with the same fluid grace she had shown in the snow, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she spoke in Apache. The effect was immediate and remarkable. The horses' ears pricked forward, and their nervous dancing gradually stilled. Samuel watched in amazement as Ayanna approached each animal in turn, her hands moving in slow, deliberate gestures that seemed to calm them instantly. Within minutes, she had haltered the most nervous horse, a young stallion that usually took Samuel considerable effort to handle. How did you do that? He asked as they led the horses through the storm toward the smaller building. Animals speak same language everywhere, Ayanna replied. Fear, calm, trust. They know when person understands them, when person respects them. As they settled the horses in their temporary shelter, Samuel found himself reevaluating his initial assessment of this Apache girl. Her ability to read both the weather and the animals, suggested knowledge and skills that went far beyond what he had expected. Perhaps there was more to learn from her than he had initially thought. By morning, the storm had transformed Samuel's ranch into an alien landscape. Snow drifts reached nearly to the windows on the north side of the house, and the world beyond was a pristine white expanse broken only by the dark shapes of buried fence posts and the jagged outline of the fallen tree on the barn roof. The wind had finally died, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to amplify every small sound. Samuel stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, surveying the damage. The storm had dumped over 2 feet of snow, more than he'd seen in a single night in over a decade. His truck was completely buried, and the access road would be impassable for days even after the county plows got through. They were effectively cut off from the outside world. Ayanna emerged from the guest room where Martha had insisted she spend the night. She had slept on the floor despite their offers of the bed, explaining that she was more comfortable on a firm surface. Now she moved to the window beside Samuel, studying the landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Beautiful," she said simply. Samuel almost choked on his coffee. "Beautiful? This is a disaster. Look at that barn roof. The horses are crammed into a shed that's too small for them. The cattle are probably buried somewhere out there. And we can't even get to town for supplies." Ayanna turned to look at him with those dark, penetrating eyes. "You see only problems. But snow brings many gifts, too." "Gifts?" Samuel's voice carried a skeptical edge. What gifts could come from this mess? Water for dry summer. Rest for land. Time to learn patience. Ayanna moved toward the door, pulling on her still inadequate jacket. Also, snow tells stories. "Want to see?" Despite his frustration with the situation, Samuel found himself curious about what she meant. Martha encouraged him to go, pointing out that they couldn't do much about the barn until the weather cleared anyway. Reluctantly, Samuel bundled up and followed Ayanna outside. The cold was sharp but manageable without the wind. Ayanna led him away from the house, moving through the deep snow with that same effortless grace he'd noticed the night before. She seemed to know exactly where to step to avoid the deepest drifts, reading the subtle contours of the buried landscape. "Here," she said, stopping beside what looked like a random patch of snow. "Rabbits came through early this morning before last snow stopped. See?" She pointed to barely visible depressions in the white surface. "They know where wind leaves snow shallow, where they can move fast if needed." Samuel squinted at the area she indicated. Gradually, he began to make out the faint traces of tracks, so subtle they might have been his imagination. "How can you possibly see that?" "Grandfather teach me to read snow like book. Every mark tells story. Where animal go, how fast, why they choose that path." Ayanna moved to another spot. "Here, dear family. Mother and 2 young ones. They shelter under that overhang during worst of storm." She led him on a circuitous route around the ranch, pointing out signs that were invisible to Samuel's untrained eye. Coyote tracks that revealed a pack's hunting strategy, bird markings that showed where they had struggled against the wind. Even the patterns of snow accumulation told stories about air currents and temperature changes during the night. "This is all very interesting," Samuel said, though he had to admit he was somewhat fascinated despite himself. "But I don't see how it helps with practical problems. I still have a damaged barn and buried cattle to worry about." Ayanna paused beside a large drift that had formed against a cluster of boulders. "Your cattle," she said. "They are here." Samuel stared at the seemingly empty snowfield. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing here but snow. Look closer. See how snow is higher in some places, how there are small holes where warm air escapes." Gradually, Samuel began to notice what she was indicating. There were indeed subtle variations in the snow's surface, and now that she mentioned it, he could see tiny dark spots that might be breathing holes. "Are you saying my cattle are buried under all this snow?" "Not buried, sheltered. Cattle are smart, especially your older cows. When storm came, they found windbreak in rocks huddled together for warmth. Snow became blanket, keeping them warm inside." Samuel felt a surge of panic. "They'll suffocate. We have to dig them out." "No," Ayanna said firmly, catching his arm as he started toward the drift. "They are safe as long as breathing holes stay open. If you dig now, you remove their protection from cold. Better to wait. Let them emerge when they're ready." The concept went against every instinct Samuel had about caring for livestock. His grandfather had always taught him that animals needed constant human intervention to survive harsh weather. The idea of leaving cattle buried in snow, Trusting them to know what was best for themselves seemed irresponsible at best. "You're asking me to gamble with my animals' lives based on some Apache folklore," Samuel said, his voice tight with worry. Ayana's expression didn't change. "Not folklore. Observation. Experience. Apache watch bison do same thing for hundreds of years. Survive blizzards that kill men with warm houses and big fires. Bison are wild animals. These are domestic cattle. Your cattle still have same instincts, still know how to survive if you let them." Ayana studied his face, seeming to read his internal struggle. "If you want, we can check breathing holes, make sure they stay clear. But digging them out now would be a mistake." Samuel wrestled with the decision. Everything in his experience screamed that he should take action, do something to help his animals. But there was something in Ayana's calm certainty that gave him pause. She had been right about the horses' location, right about their behavior in the barn. Maybe she was right about this too. "Show me these breathing holes," he said finally. Ayana led him closer to the drift, pointing out small, dark openings in the snow that he would never have noticed on his own. The air around them was noticeably warmer, and Samuel could occasionally hear the soft sounds of cattle moving beneath the white blanket. "See? They make own environment. Body heat warms air, snow insulates. Like natural igloo." Ayana knelt beside one of the holes, listening intently. "This one is Belle, your old Holstein. She keeps others calm." Samuel was startled by her accurate identification of his lead cow. "How could you possibly know that?" "Each animal sounds different. Belle has deeper voice, more authority. Others listen when she speaks." They spent the next hour checking the various breathing holes and monitoring the sounds from beneath the snow. Samuel gradually began to understand what Ayana was showing him. The cattle weren't trapped or suffering. They were actively managing their environment, using their collective body heat and the insulating properties of snow to create a survival system that was remarkably effective. "This goes against everything I was taught about ranching," Samuel admitted as they walked back toward the house. "Maybe your teachers never learned from winter itself," Ayana suggested. "Sometimes best lessons come from watching, not from books or other people's words." As they approached the house, Samuel found himself looking at his ranch with new eyes. The storm damage was still there, still requiring attention and resources to fix. But Ayana had shown him that disaster and adaptation often occurred simultaneously. That survival sometimes meant working with natural forces rather than against them. Martha met them at the door with hot coffee and worried questions about the cattle. When Samuel explained what Ayana had shown him, his wife looked skeptical but ultimately deferred to his judgment. After 40 years of marriage, she trusted his decisions about ranch management, even when they seemed unconventional. "So what do we do now?" Martha asked. Samuel looked at Ayana, realizing that for the first time in his adult life he was genuinely uncertain about the best course of action. The Apache girl had shaken his confidence in methods and assumptions he'd never thought to question. But rather than feeling frustrated by this uncertainty, he found himself curious to learn more. "I think," Samuel said slowly, "we wait and watch, and maybe learn something new about what survival really means." The second day dawned clear and bitter cold, with sunlight that sparkled off the snow like scattered diamonds but provided little warmth. Samuel woke to find Ayana already awake, sitting cross-legged by the living room window and watching the sunrise with the focused attention of someone reading an important document. "Sleep well?" Martha asked, bustling around the kitchen and preparing breakfast for their unexpected guest. "Sleep when body needs rest, wake when mind needs to work," Ayana replied, not taking her eyes from the window. "Today will be good day for learning." Samuel joined her at the window, following her gaze across the transformed landscape. "Learning what exactly?" "How to listen to what land tells us. Storm is finished, but winter is not. More cold coming, maybe more snow. Animals know this. Plants know this. Only people forget to pay attention." Samuel studied the pristine vista, trying to see what Ayana was seeing. To him, it looked like a typical winter morning after a blizzard. Cold, bright, and challenging for anyone trying to maintain a ranch operation. What exactly should I be listening for? Ayana finally turned from the window, her dark eyes serious. "Your cattle will start moving today, not because storm is over, but because they sense what comes next. If we watch where they go, how they behave, we learn what they know about surviving winter that we forgot." The idea of learning survival techniques from his own livestock struck Samuel as absurd. But he was beginning to understand that Ayana's seemingly simple observations often contained deeper wisdom than they first appeared to contain. "And how exactly do we watch cattle that are buried under 2 feet of snow?" "We wait, they will emerge when ready. Then we follow, observe, learn." Ayana moved toward the door. "But first we check breathing holes, make sure paths stay clear." Samuel grabbed his coat and followed her outside. The cold was sharp enough to make his lungs ache, but the absence of wind made it bearable. Their footsteps squeaked in the dry snow as they made their way across the white expanse, toward the cluster of boulders where his cattle had taken shelter. The breathing holes were still there, though smaller than they had been the day before. Ayana examined each one carefully, occasionally listening with her ear close to the openings. "They are restless," she announced. "We'll start moving soon." "How can you possibly tell that from listening to breathing holes?" "Cattle make different sounds when they prepare to move. Breathing changes, small vocalizations, shifting weight." Ayana stood and surveyed the surrounding area. "They will head toward morning sun, where snow melts first and grass might be easier to find." As if summoned by her words, the snow near one of the larger breathing holes began to shift and bulge. Samuel watched in fascination as Belle, his lead Holstein, emerged from beneath the white blanket like some mythical creature rising from an underground realm. The cow shook herself vigorously, sending clouds of snow flying, then stood still for a moment as if testing the air and evaluating the conditions. Other cattle began emerging from various points around the sheltered area, each one following the same pattern of cautious emergence and environmental assessment. Samuel counted them automatically, a habit ingrained by years of managing livestock. All 23 head were accounted for, and they appeared to be in surprisingly good condition despite their night buried in snow. "They're not even shivering," Samuel observed, amazed. "Body heat was trapped in snow shelter. They stayed warmer than your horses in the shed," Ayana replied. "Now watch where they go." Belle began moving slowly through the deep snow, her massive bulk creating a trail that the other cattle could follow. But instead of heading directly toward the barn where Samuel normally fed them, she led the group in a meandering path that seemed to have no obvious destination. "She's going the wrong way," Samuel said, starting to follow the cattle. "The hay is stored near the barn." Ayana caught his arm gently. "Let them lead. See where their instincts take them before you impose your plans." Samuel reluctantly stopped, though every instinct told him to intervene and guide his animals toward food and shelter. The cattle continued their seemingly aimless wandering, with Belle occasionally stopping to paw at the snow or test the wind direction with her nose. After nearly an hour of patient observation, the purpose of Belle's route became clear. She had led the herd to a section of Samuel's property, where a south-facing slope created a natural windbreak and received maximum sun exposure. The snow here was noticeably thinner, and patches of dried grass were already becoming visible as the morning sun did its work. "Incredible," Samuel murmured. "She found the one spot on my entire ranch where they can actually graze today." "Animals read landscape differently than people," Ayana explained. "They think about survival first, comfort second. Your barn is comfortable, but this place provides food and protection from wind, more important for long-term survival." Samuel watched his cattle begin to forage successfully in the thinning snow, their behavior completely contrary to everything he had been taught about winter cattle management. According to conventional wisdom, livestock needed to be brought into barns during severe weather, fed stored hay, and protected from the elements by human intervention. Yet here were his animals, demonstrating that they could not only survive but thrive using strategies he had never considered. "My grandfather would say this is neglectful animal husbandry," Samuel said, voicing his internal conflict. "Maybe your grandfather never had chance to watch cattle make their own choices," Ayana suggested. "Easy to assume animals need human help when you never give them chance to show what they can do." The observation stung because it highlighted a fundamental assumption Samuel had never questioned. He had always seen his role as a rancher as protecting and providing for his animals. But perhaps he had been imposing unnecessary limitations on their natural abilities. "It's not just about the cattle, is it?" Samuel asked, beginning to understand the deeper implications of what Ayana was showing him. Survival is survival. Same principles for animals, plants, people. Modern world teaches people they need many things to live comfortably. But Apache learned that comfort and survival are different things. Sometimes comfort makes survival harder. Samuel thought about his warm house, his stored food, his heavy winter clothing, and heated vehicles. All of these things certainly made winter more pleasant, but had they also made him less capable of surviving without them? Ayanna had endured a blizzard with minimal protection and emerged not only alive but apparently unaffected by the experience. "Show me what you mean," Samuel said. "Show me how someone survives without all the modern conveniences." Ayanna studied his face as if measuring his sincerity. "Learning takes time. Cannot show everything in one day, but we can start with small lessons." She led him away from the grazing cattle toward a grove of bare trees at the edge of his property. The snow here was deeper because the trees had caught and held the falling flakes, but Ayanna moved through it with that same fluid efficiency he had observed before. "First lesson," she said, stopping beside a large oak tree. "How to stay warm without fire." Samuel looked around skeptically. The temperature was still well below freezing, and despite his heavy coat and insulated boots, he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. "I'm listening. Body makes heat all the time. Problem is losing heat too fast to air, to ground, to wind." Ayanna demonstrated by sitting down in the snow with her back against the tree trunk. Tree blocks whined from one direction. Snow on ground actually warmer than air above it. Sitting position conserves energy, keeps blood flowing to important parts. Samuel reluctantly sat down beside her, immediately feeling the cold seeping through his heavy coat. "This doesn't feel warmer. Because you fight against cold instead of working with it. Cold makes muscles tight, makes breathing shallow. If you relax, let body adjust. Cold becomes just another condition, not enemy." Ayanna began speaking in a low rhythmic voice, guiding Samuel through breathing exercises that helped him relax his tensed muscles. Gradually, he found that the cold became less sharp, less overwhelming. He was still aware of it, but it no longer dominated his attention. "Your grandfather, during Apache wars, he learned similar techniques," Ayanna said quietly. "Soldiers who survive mountains are those who adapt, not those who fight against conditions they cannot change." The comparison to his grandfather's military experience resonated with Samuel. He had heard stories of brutal winter campaigns where survival depended on adaptation and mental toughness rather than equipment alone. Perhaps the skills Ayanna was demonstrating weren't so different from the harsh lessons his grandfather had learned in these same mountains decades earlier. They sat in companionable silence for nearly an hour, with Ayanna occasionally pointing out signs of animal activity or explaining how various plants and trees adapted to winter conditions. Samuel found himself becoming more aware of subtle details he had never noticed before. The way wind patterns changed around different obstacles, how snow accumulated differently on various surfaces, the sounds that indicated animal movement even when the creatures themselves were invisible. When they finally returned to the house, Samuel felt different somehow. The cold was still cold, the snow was still snow, but his relationship to these conditions had shifted slightly. Instead of seeing winter as an adversary to be defeated with technology and resources, he was beginning to understand it as a set of conditions that could be navigated with knowledge and adaptation. Martha greeted them with hot soup and worried questions about their extended absence. As they warmed themselves by the fire, Samuel found himself looking at his comfortable home with new eyes. The warmth and shelter were certainly pleasant, but Ayanna had shown him that they weren't the only ways to survive harsh conditions. "What's next?" Samuel asked, surprising himself with his eagerness to continue learning. Ayanna smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her. "Next, we watch your cattle some more. They have more lessons to teach if we are willing to be students." The third morning brought ominous clouds gathering on the horizon, and Samuel woke with the familiar anxiety of a rancher reading bad weather signs. But when he found Ayanna already studying the sky from the kitchen window, her expression was calm, almost anticipatory. "Another storm coming," Samuel said, joining her with his coffee. "Yes, but smaller than first one. We'll test what we learned." Ayanna turned from the window. "Your cattle, they know too. Watch how they behave today. They will teach us about preparing for what cannot be avoided." Samuel had spent the previous evening reflecting on everything Ayanna had shown him over the past 2 days. Her unconventional approach to animal management had proven remarkably effective, but he still struggled with abandoning decades of established practice. Today would be another test of whether to trust her methods or fall back on familiar routines. After breakfast, they ventured out to check on the cattle. Belle and her companions had moved again during the night, this time to a different section of the south-facing slope, where a natural depression provided additional wind protection. Samuel noticed that they had arranged themselves in a tight cluster, with the larger animals on the outside and smaller ones protected in the center. "They are making fortress," Ayanna observed. "Each animal contributes body heat to group, shares warmth with others. When storm comes, they will lower heads, turn backs to wind, become like one large animal." "But shouldn't I bring them into the barn?" Samuel asked, the question that had been nagging at him since yesterday. "I have hay stored, warm shelter, protection from the weather." Ayanna considered this carefully before responding. "Barn is good for severe emergency, when animals are sick or injured. But for healthy cattle, natural behavior often better than human solution. They know how to survive storms. Question is whether you trust their knowledge." The concept of trusting his livestock to make survival decisions remained foreign to Samuel, despite the evidence he had witnessed. His entire approach to ranching had been built on the assumption that animals needed constant human guidance and intervention. Ayanna was asking him to question fundamental beliefs about his role and responsibilities. What if I'm wrong? What if they get into trouble and I could have prevented it? What if you are wrong to always interfere? What if your help sometimes makes animals weaker, less able to survive on their own? Ayanna's response was gentle but pointed. Apache children learn early that too much protection can be its own danger. Samuel watched his cattle preparing for the approaching storm with behaviors he had never really noticed before. They were positioning themselves strategically, conserving energy, and demonstrating what appeared to be sophisticated understanding of weather patterns and group dynamics. Perhaps Ayanna was right that his well-intentioned interventions had prevented him from seeing capabilities his animals possessed naturally. The wind began to pick up as they walked back toward the house, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Martha was waiting for them with worried news from the battery radio. "Weather Service is calling this a severe storm warning," she reported. "They're saying it could be worse than the first one, with high winds and possible whiteout conditions." Samuel felt his anxiety spike. "That settles it. I'm bringing the cattle into the barn, storm or no storm." "Wait," Ayanna said quietly. "Let us watch sky together, read what wind tells us. Sometimes Weather Service sees only big picture, misses local conditions." Against his better judgment, Samuel followed Ayanna back outside. She stood motionless for several minutes, her face turned toward the approaching clouds, apparently reading atmospheric conditions with senses Samuel didn't fully understand. "Storm will be strong but brief," she announced finally. "Most energy will pass south of here. We will get wind and snow, but not the killing cold of 3 days ago." "How can you possibly know that?" Samuel demanded, his frustration with her unconventional methods finally boiling over. "You don't have instruments, you can't see radar, you're just guessing based on folklore and wishful thinking." Ayanna's expression didn't change at his outburst. "Grandfather teach me to read what sky shows, what wind carries, what animals and birds do when weather changes. These signs are more reliable than voices on radio talking about places far away." To prove her point, she directed Samuel's attention to the behavior of various creatures around the ranch. The horses in the temporary shed were alert but not panicked. Birds were moving to shelter but not with the desperate urgency that preceded truly dangerous storms. Even the ranch dogs seemed more interested than anxious about the approaching weather. "Animals know difference between uncomfortable storm and deadly storm," Ayanna explained. "They prepare differently for each type. Your cattle are ready for discomfort, not fighting for life." Samuel wanted to dismiss her observations as primitive superstition, but the past few days had demonstrated the accuracy of her weather-reading abilities. She had correctly predicted the behavior of his livestock, the duration of the first storm, and the locations where conditions would be most favorable for grazing. Perhaps her methods were different from modern meteorology, but they seemed to work. "Even if you're right about the storm," Samuel said, "why take unnecessary risks? The barn is there, it's warm and dry. Why not use it?" "Because using barn when not necessary teaches cattle to depend on human help instead of own abilities," Ayanna replied. "What happens when you are not here to help them? What happens when barn is damaged or destroyed? Animals that learn only one way to survive become weak, vulnerable." The argument struck Samuel as both logical and troubling. He had always viewed his protective interventions as responsible animal husbandry, but Ayana was suggesting that constant protection might actually weaken his livestock's natural survival abilities. It was a perspective that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between humans and domestic animals. As the storm clouds drew closer, Samuel found himself facing a difficult decision. Trust conventional ranching wisdom and bring his cattle to safety, or follow Ayana's advice and allow them to weather the storm using their own strategies. The choice represented more than just animal management. It was a test of whether he could adapt his thinking to incorporate radically different approaches to survival. If I let them stay out there and something goes wrong, their suffering is on my conscience, Samuel said, voicing his deepest concern. If you always protect them from learning to protect themselves, their weakness is also on your conscience, Ayana countered. Apache parents face same choice with children. Too much protection creates adults who cannot survive alone. The comparison to child rearing resonated with Samuel. He and Martha had struggled with similar decisions when raising their own children, trying to balance protection with the need to develop independence and resilience. Perhaps the same principles applied to livestock management. The first snowflakes began falling as they discussed the decision, and Samuel could see his cattle instinctively tightening their formation and positioning themselves to present minimal surface area to the wind. Their behavior suggested they were implementing survival strategies without any human guidance or intervention. One more test, Samuel decided. But if conditions get worse than you predicted, I'm bringing them in regardless of your philosophy. Ayana nodded her acceptance of the compromise. Fair agreement, but also fair that you watch how they manage storm. See what they can teach about survival without human help. As the storm intensified throughout the afternoon, Samuel found himself constantly looking out the window and fighting the urge to intervene. The cattle remained clustered in their chosen position, heads lowered against the wind, presenting a unified front against the elements. Their strategy was clearly effective, but watching them endure harsh conditions without providing help went against every protective instinct Samuel possessed. They look miserable out there, Martha observed, joining him at the window. Miserable is not same as endangered, Ayana said from her position by the fire. Comfort and survival are different things. Those cattle are surviving very well. By evening, it became clear that Ayana's weather prediction had been accurate. The storm was strong but not catastrophic, bringing significant wind and moderate snowfall but lacking the killing cold and extended duration of the earlier blizzard. Samuel's cattle had weathered it successfully, emerging from the experience apparently no worse for wear. I still don't understand how you knew, Samuel admitted as they prepared for bed. Knowledge comes from attention, Ayana replied simply. When you watch sky every day, listen to wind every day, observe animals every day, patterns become clear. Modern people look at phones and computers for weather but forget to look at world around them. That night, Samuel lay awake thinking about the implications of what he had witnessed. Ayana had demonstrated survival skills and animal management techniques that challenged fundamental assumptions about ranching, protection, and the relationship between humans and nature. Her methods seemed to work, but accepting them required abandoning approaches his family had used for generations. More troubling was the realization that his protective interventions might have actually weakened his animal's natural abilities. If Ayana was right, his well-intentioned care had created dependency rather than resilience. The thought was both humbling and deeply unsettling. Outside, his cattle rested peacefully in the snow, having successfully survived another storm using strategies older than human civilization. Samuel was beginning to understand that true survival might have less to do with controlling nature and more to do with learning from it. The fourth morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every distant peak visible in sharp detail. Samuel woke to find Ayana's bedroll empty and discovered her outside, sitting motionless on a fallen log near the house, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Time for me to go home, she said simply when Samuel approached. Storm is finished. Family will worry. The announcement hit Samuel with unexpected force. Over the past 3 days, this Apache girl had fundamentally changed his understanding of survival, animal management, and his relationship with the natural world. The thought of her leaving felt like losing a teacher before the lessons were complete. The roads aren't clear yet, Samuel said, grasping for reasons to delay her departure. And you don't have proper winter gear for traveling in these conditions. Ayana smiled at his concern. Roads are for vehicles. I know mountain trails that stay passable even in winter, and Apache have traveled these mountains in cold much worse than this for many generations. Samuel realized he was trying to apply his own limitations to someone who operated by entirely different rules. Ayana's casual confidence about traveling through snow-covered wilderness with minimal equipment would have seemed foolhardy a week ago. Now he understood it as evidence of knowledge and skills he was only beginning to appreciate. "Before you go," Samuel said, "I need to understand something. Why did you help me? Why teach me these things? Our peoples haven't exactly been friends." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying the snow-covered landscape. "Grandfather tells stories about Apache wars, about soldiers and battles and much suffering on both sides. But he also tells stories about individual people who choose to see beyond old conflicts, who learn from each other instead of fighting." She stood and began walking toward the area where his cattle had spent the night. Samuel followed, listening as she continued. "Your grandfather and mine, they were enemies because of circumstances, because of fear and misunderstanding. But hatred is learned thing, passed down like other knowledge, can also choose to learn different lessons, to see other person as teacher instead of enemy." The cattle were indeed preparing to move, just as Ayana had predicted. Belle was already on her feet, testing the air and surveying the terrain with apparent satisfaction. The other animals were stirring, shaking off snow and organizing themselves for whatever came next. "Watch," Ayana said. "They will show you final lesson about survival." Instead of heading toward their usual feeding area near the barn, Belle led the herd in a different direction entirely. They moved through the snow with purposeful determination, following a route that took them around the ranch's perimeter, rather than toward any obvious destination. "Where are they going?" Samuel asked, puzzled by the cattle's behavior. "They are checking territory, making sure environment is safe and stable after storm," Ayana explained. "Animals understand that survival depends on knowing conditions of entire area they live in, not just immediate shelter." Samuel watched his livestock systematically explore different sections of his property, testing snow depth, evaluating wind patterns, and apparently cataloging changes brought by the recent storms. Their behavior suggested a level of environmental awareness and strategic thinking he had never recognized before. "It's like they're conducting a survey," Samuel mused. "Exactly. They are gathering information they need for future survival decisions. Apache hunters do same thing after storms, after any major change in conditions. Knowledge of environment is most important tool for staying alive." As they followed the cattle's patrol route, Ayana pointed out dozens of subtle details that revealed how the storm had altered the landscape. Wind patterns had changed around certain buildings. Snow accumulation had created new microclimates in various locations. Water sources had shifted as streams were blocked or redirected by ice and debris. "See how much you learn just by paying attention?" Ayana asked. "Your cattle understand that survival requires constant learning, constant adaptation to changing conditions." Samuel found himself seeing his own ranch through new eyes. Instead of a static environment to be controlled and managed, he was beginning to understand it as a dynamic system that required ongoing observation and flexible responses. His cattle weren't just livestock to be fed and sheltered. They were fellow inhabitants of this landscape, possessing knowledge and skills that could inform his own survival strategies. "This changes everything," Samuel said, the full implications of Ayana's lessons finally becoming clear. "Everything I thought I knew about ranching, about managing animals, about surviving in harsh conditions. Change is good when it leads to better understanding," Ayana replied. Apache believed that learning never stops, that even old people can discover new ways to see world. They spent the morning following the cattle and observing their systematic exploration of the post-storm environment. Samuel found himself taking mental notes about areas where snow melted fastest, locations that provided natural windbreaks, and signs that indicated underground water sources. Information he had never thought to gather before suddenly seemed essential for effective ranch management. When they returned to the house for lunch, Martha had prepared a special meal to mark Ayana's departure. The conversation over the table was subdued, with all three adults aware that an unusual and transformative experience was coming to an end. "Will you tell your family about staying here?" Martha asked. "Yes, and I will tell them about rancher who learned to listen to his cattle, who chose to see Apache girl as teacher instead of trespasser." Ayana's response carried warmth and respect that hadn't been present when she first arrived, Samuel realized that the transformation had been mutual. Ayanna had shared her knowledge generously, but in doing so, she had also learned something about the possibility of bridging cultural divides through individual relationships. Her initial wariness had given way to something approaching friendship. "What will you tell them about me?" Samuel asked. "That you have good heart, willing to learn, willing to change old ideas when presented with new evidence. These are qualities Apache respect in any person, regardless of ancestry." After lunch, Samuel insisted on walking with Ayanna to the edge of his property, where tribal lands began. The boundary was marked by a simple fence that had always seemed significant before, but now felt arbitrary and meaningless. The same landscape, the same weather, the same survival challenges existed on both sides of the wire. "Will I see you again?" Samuel asked as they reached the fence line. "Maybe. Or maybe you will see other Apache, other opportunities to learn and teach." Ayanna paused at the fence, looking back at Samuel's ranch spread out below them. "What matters is that you remember lessons, that you keep watching and listening to what land tells you." Samuel watched her cross into tribal territory and begin making her way up a barely visible trail that led into the high country. She moved through the snow with that same fluid grace he had admired from the beginning, becoming smaller and smaller until she disappeared entirely among the trees and rocks. Walking back to the house, Samuel felt profoundly changed by the experience. The Apache girl who had appeared in his barn during a blizzard had challenged every assumption he held about survival, animal management, and the relationship between humans and nature. More importantly, she had demonstrated that learning could occur across cultural boundaries when people approached each other with respect and open minds. That evening, as he sat by the fire with Martha, Samuel found himself planning changes to his ranching practices. He would spend more time observing his cattle's natural behaviors before intervening. He would pay closer attention to weather signs and environmental conditions. He would trust his animals' survival instincts more, and his protective impulses less. "She was remarkable," Martha said, echoing his thoughts. "That girl taught us things we never would have learned otherwise." Samuel nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "She showed me that survival isn't about having the most resources or the best equipment. It's about understanding your environment, adapting to changing conditions, and learning from everything around you." Outside, his cattle rested peacefully in the snow, having successfully navigated another challenging period using strategies developed over thousands of years. Samuel realized that true survival wisdom came not from dominating nature, but from learning to read its patterns and work within its constraints. The Apache girl had slept in the snow without a fire and emerged unharmed, demonstrating a form of survival knowledge that transcended modern technology and conventional approaches. In teaching him to see his own animals as sources of wisdom, rather than objects requiring protection, she had revealed the true meaning of survival. Not just staying alive, but developing the knowledge and adaptability to thrive in harmony with the natural world. Samuel Morrison, a 62-year-old rancher who thought he knew everything about managing livestock and surviving harsh winters, had been transformed by 3 days with an Apache teenager who understood that survival was about learning from the world around you, not trying to control it. The lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life, and perhaps, if he was lucky, he would have the opportunity to pass it on to others who were ready to learn.